You think ruthless looks like anger. You think it looks like shouting, revenge, or destruction. But that's not how it looks when an empath finally reaches the end. It looks like quiet. It looks like someone who once cared too much, suddenly caring no more. And that's what no narcissist ever prepares for. Because a fed-up empath doesn't fight back. They disconnect. No warnings, no final speech. One day, the emotional door they kept open for so long is just closed. And the narcissist feels it instantly, not as pain, but as panic, because the attention is gone, the reactions are gone, the access is gone. In this video, you're going to understand why this moment is more ruthless than any revenge could ever be, why silence hurts more than words, and why when an empath is done, there is no return, no repair, no second chance. If you've ever felt this shift inside yourself or watched it happen to someone you underestimated, stay with me until the end. And if this speaks to your experience, don't just watch silently. Drop a comment that says, "I see it now," or hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because once you understand this, you can't unsee it. When an empath reaches the point of being truly fed up, one of the most profound shifts they experience is the realization that closure cannot be given by someone else. For years, empaths often search for answers, explanations, or apologies from those who hurt them, hoping that hearing the words "I'm sorry" or seeing genuine remorse will finally bring peace. They replay conversations, analyze behaviors, and question themselves endlessly, looking for some external validation that what happened to them was not their fault. For a narcissist, this search for closure can be manipulated endlessly, twisted into new cycles of guilt, charm, or deception. But a fed-up empath eventually understands a truth that many people never fully grasp. Closure is not something the other person provides. It is something the empath creates within themselves. This shift does not happen overnight. It is born from repeated experiences of being misunderstood, ignored, or gaslighted. Each time the empath reaches out for answers that never come, or each time the narcissist avoids accountability, the empath learns a painful but necessary lesson. Seeking closure from someone who has no intention of giving it only prolongs suffering. Empaths are naturally inclined to see the best in people, to give second chances, and to try to repair what is broken. But when they are done, that inclination transforms into self-preservation. They no longer rely on someone else's recognition of wrongdoing to feel whole. Instead, they turn inward, cultivating understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness that is independent of external validation. This realization is empowering because it releases the empath from an exhausting and often futile cycle. They no longer feel the need to justify their feelings, replay past events in their mind, or wait for acknowledgement that may never come. Instead, they focus on reclaiming their own emotional energy and rebuilding their life on terms that serve their well-being. By shifting the source of closure from the other person to themselves, they regain a sense of control that was previously denied to them. They learn that they do not need permission to move on, and they no longer rely on the absence of apology or recognition to dictate their emotional state. When an empath reaches the stage of becoming untouchable, it is the culmination of years of self-discovery, emotional endurance, and the hard lessons learned from interactions with those who manipulated, drained, or betrayed them. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor is it born from a desire for revenge or to punish anyone. Rather, it is the natural evolution of someone who has finally recognized the value of their emotional energy and the futility of surrendering it to those who have no intention of honoring it. Becoming untouchable does not mean the empath becomes cold or cruel. It does not mean they turn off their heart or abandon their capacity to feel. On the contrary, it is the result of deep empathy, honed into clarity, and finally tempered with discernment. It is the ultimate form of protection, a state where emotional boundaries are so firmly in place that they can no longer be breached, no matter how sophisticated or insidious the manipulative tactics may be. For a narcissist, the empath's untouchability is both baffling and terrifying. Narcissists rely on access to attention, admiration, validation, and emotional reactions. They thrive on influence and control, and their sense of significance is entirely dependent on how they can elicit responses from others. The empath, by becoming untouchable, removes that access completely. Nothing the narcissist does, no gaslighting, no guilt-tripping, no love-bombing, can penetrate this wall. The empath is no longer playing by the old rules, no longer available to be manipulated, and no longer emotionally reactive. The tools that once created leverage for the narcissist have become useless. In essence, the empath has stepped out of the game entirely, and in doing so, they hold a power that is both silent and absolute. This untouchable state begins with the accumulation of self-awareness. Over time, the empath observes patterns, recognizes repeated manipulation, and understands the motives behind harmful behaviors. They see the emotional games clearly, but they no longer feel compelled to engage in them. Their emotional intelligence, once used to navigate relationships and respond to others' needs, becomes a tool for self-preservation. They learn to distinguish between genuine connection and transactional interactions designed to exploit their empathy. This awareness is the foundation of untouchability, the ability to perceive without attachment, to understand without reaction, and to protect without confrontation. A critical aspect of becoming untouchable is the development of unwavering boundaries. These boundaries are no longer suggestions or negotiable rules, they are concrete, non-negotiable limits. The empath enforces them consistently, without guilt or hesitation. If someone attempts to overstep, there is no negotiation, no apology, and no internal questioning. The empath simply disengages. This is different from cutting someone off impulsively or out of anger. It is a deliberate, conscious choice to maintain emotional integrity. Boundaries become a protective armor that cannot be pierced, and this consistency is what makes the empath untouchable in a way that is both subtle and unassailable. Detachment is another cornerstone of this state. The empath no longer invests emotionally in outcomes controlled by others. They understand that the need for approval, recognition, or reconciliation is self-imposed, and that waiting for it from someone incapable of giving it is futile. Detachment does not mean indifference in a dismissive sense. Rather, it is a form of freedom. The empath is emotionally autonomous. They respond to life, relationships, and challenges from a place of grounded stability, not from reactive emotion or the need for external validation. The narcissist, accustomed to controlling reactions, finds this detachment maddening because it cannot be provoked or manipulated. The empath's calm presence, or even their absence, speaks volumes without words, and it carries a quiet authority that the narcissist cannot undermine. When indifference replaces emotional investment, it signals the true ending of the dynamic. This is not bitterness or coldness. It is emotional closure that has already happened internally. For a long time, the empath's attention, concern, and emotional reactions kept the connection alive. Even pain was a form of investment. Arguments, tears, disappointment, and attempts to fix things all confirmed that the other person still mattered. But when indifference arrives, it means the empath has finally stopped assigning emotional weight. The connection no longer holds meaning, and that shift changes everything. To a narcissist, this is deeply unsettling. Their sense of importance depends on being emotionally central in someone else's world. Whether through admiration or conflict, they need to feel significant. Indifference removes that significance entirely. The empath no longer reacts to provocation, no longer feels the urge to defend themselves, and no longer needs acknowledgement. Messages feel optional instead of urgent. Silence feels natural instead of painful. The narcissist senses this absence immediately because the emotional mirror they relied on has gone dark. What makes indifference so powerful is that it cannot be manipulated. Anger can be provoked. Sadness can be exploited. Hope can be used to reopen doors. But indifference offers nothing to pull on. There is no emotional thread left to tug. The empath's calm is steady and unresponsive, not as a tactic, but as a genuine state of detachment. This often confuses the narcissist, who may escalate their behavior, trying to recreate intensity just to feel relevant again. But intensity no longer lands. The empath has already moved on emotionally. This shift happens when the empath fully accepts that their emotional energy is valuable. They no longer spend it on people who drain rather than nourish them. Instead of monitoring the narcissist's moods or reactions, they turn their attention inward toward their own stability and peace. Emotional investment is redirected into healthier spaces, leaving no surplus energy for old dynamics. The narcissist may continue to seek attention, but the empath no longer feels compelled to respond. Indifference feels like erasure to a narcissist because it removes their role in the story. They are no longer the hero, the villain, or the center of conflict. They become irrelevant. This loss of relevance is more painful than rejection because rejection still acknowledges importance. Indifference does not. It quietly communicates that the chapter has closed and nothing remains to be discussed. When boundaries become non-negotiable for an empath, it marks the end of a long internal struggle. This is not a sudden decision or a cold transformation. It is the result of repeated lessons, broken trust, and emotional exhaustion. For a long time, the empath gave chances because they believed in growth, understanding, and second chances. They bent their own limits in the name of compassion, hoping empathy would inspire change. But over time, they learned that endless flexibility only taught others how far they could be pushed. Once that realization settles in, the empath stops negotiating their well-being. At this stage, boundaries are no longer emotional requests or hopeful expectations. They are clear, quiet rules enforced through action, not explanation. The empath no longer debates what is acceptable or explains why certain behavior hurts. They don't issue ultimatums or wait for understanding. They simply remove themselves from situations that violate their limits. This is what makes the shift so powerful. There is no emotional charge attached to the boundary, no guilt layered into the decision. The empath is not angry. They are resolved. For someone accustomed to crossing lines, this feels shocking. The narcissist may test the boundary, expecting it to bend the way it always did before. They may attempt guilt, charm, blame, or emotional pressure, but none of it works anymore. The empath does not react, over-explain, or soften the line. There are no emotional leaks, no late responses, no comforting words, no reassurance offered after being disrespected. The boundary stands firm because it is no longer tied to hope or fear. What has changed is the empath's relationship with empathy itself. They still feel deeply, but they no longer sacrifice themselves to prove it. They understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. So instead of pouring emotional energy into fixing someone else, they redirect it toward protecting their peace. This creates a sense of emotional stability that cannot be easily disrupted. The empath is no longer pulled into cycles of apology, justification, or emotional repair that they didn't cause. This shift often feels ruthless to the person on the other side because it removes access they once took for granted. The empath no longer tolerates disrespect in the name of love or understanding. They no longer reopen doors just because someone knocks louder. Each boundary is enforced consistently, without drama, and that consistency sends a clear message. The old rules no longer apply. In the end, non-negotiable boundaries are not about punishment. They are about clarity. The empath has learned where they end and where others begin, and they refuse to blur that line again. There is no guilt in this stage because the empath finally understands that protecting themselves is not cruelty, it is maturity. And once boundaries are enforced without emotion attached, there is no leverage left for manipulation to work. When an empath finally detaches, the most critical shift is not anger or rejection, but the quiet decision to stop feeding the ego that once consumed so much of their energy. For a long time, the empath may have offered admiration, reassurance, emotional reactions, and constant validation without even realizing it. They listened deeply, responded thoughtfully, cared intensely, and tried to keep the emotional balance alive. To a narcissist, this steady flow of attention is not love, it is fuel. Every reaction, every attempt to explain feelings, every emotional response confirms their importance. But when detachment happens, that supply suddenly vanishes, and the impact is far more devastating than any confrontation could ever be. This detachment doesn't come from spite, it comes from exhaustion and clarity. The empath realizes that no amount of giving will ever be enough, and no explanation will ever truly be heard. So, instead of arguing, defending, or reacting, they simply stop. Compliments disappear, emotional reassurance dries up, even frustration fades away. The empath becomes neutral, steady, and emotionally unavailable. This is deeply unsettling for a narcissist because they rely on emotional mirrors to feel real and powerful. Without admiration or reaction, they are forced to sit with themselves, and that is something they avoid at all costs. What makes this so powerful is that it removes the narcissist's sense of dominance. Confrontation still gives them something to work with: anger to provoke, emotions to twist, words to manipulate. Detachment gives them nothing. The empath no longer rises to bait, no longer responds to guilt-tripping, and no longer reacts to subtle provocations. The narcissist may escalate at first, trying harder to trigger a response, but when nothing works, confusion sets in. The empath's calm becomes unbearable because it signals emotional independence. The narcissist realizes they are no longer the center of the empath's emotional world. This absence of ego feeding shifts the power dynamic completely. The empath is no longer invested in proving their worth or fixing the connection. They stop seeking approval and stop offering emotional labor for free. Their energy turns inward, focused on stability and self-respect. This quiet withdrawal often feels invisible from the outside, but internally, it is a complete reset. The empath is no longer emotionally accessible, and that loss of access is what the narcissist feels most intensely. In many cases, the narcissist will try to provoke drama just to feel significant again, but even negative attention no longer arrives. The empath's detachment is steady, not reactive. There is no need to explain or announce anything, because the decision has already been made through behavior. Over time, the narcissist is left with a hollow space where validation once existed, while the empath experiences a growing sense of peace. This is why stopping the ego supply is more devastating than confrontation. It doesn't create chaos, it creates silence. And in that silence, the narcissist loses the emotional stage they depended on, while the empath finally steps into emotional freedom. When an empath reaches the point of being fed up, something fundamental changes, and it's rarely loud or dramatic. There is no final argument, no long explanation, no emotional outburst meant to prove a point. Instead, there is a calm, deliberate shift inward. The empath stops trying to be understood by someone who never truly listened. They stop defending their intentions, stop correcting false narratives, and stop offering emotional energy where it has been consistently drained. This silence is not confusion or weakness, it is a strategic shutdown. It happens after countless moments of giving, forgiving, and hoping things would improve. By the time the empath goes quiet, the decision has already been made internally, and it is final. For a narcissist, this kind of silence is deeply unsettling. Narcissists thrive on attention, reaction, and emotional engagement, whether it is positive or negative. Arguments, tears, explanations, and even frustration all serve as fuel. When the empath removes access without warning, that supply disappears. The narcissist senses the loss immediately, even if they don't understand it at first. Messages stop getting replies, emotional hooks stop working, provocations are met with nothing. What once triggered empathy, guilt, or reassurance now meets a blank wall. The narcissist is left reaching for a response that never comes, and that absence feels more threatening than confrontation ever could. This withdrawal is powerful because it is clean and intentional. The empath doesn't announce boundaries or try to teach lessons. They simply enforce distance through consistent behavior. There is no emotional leakage, no late-night explanations, no reopening of wounds to offer clarity. The empath has learned that explanations only invite more manipulation. Silence, on the other hand, removes the narcissist's ability to twist words, rewrite conversations, or pull the empath back into old cycles. The lack of engagement collapses the power dynamic that once existed, because control requires participation, and the empath has chosen not to participate anymore. What makes this shutdown so effective is that it is rooted in self-respect, not punishment. The empath is no longer trying to win, fix, or save anyone. They are choosing peace over proving a point. That choice changes everything. Without emotional access, the narcissist cannot mirror, provoke, or extract validation. Their usual tactics fall flat, and the mask begins to slip. Meanwhile, the empath redirects their energy toward healing, growth, and stability. This growth happens quietly, without announcements or visible drama, which often confuses the narcissist even more. In the end, the silence of a fed-up empath is not empty, it is full of clarity, boundaries, and resolve. It signals that the empath has finally understood their own value and refuses to bargain with it anymore. For the narcissist, this silence feels ruthless because it offers no entry point, no reaction, and no chance to regain control. The connection doesn't end with chaos, it ends with absence. And that absence is the final loss the narcissist never saw coming. The process of becoming untouchable also involves reclaiming emotional energy. Empaths, by nature, give deeply and often excessively. They absorb moods, take on responsibilities for others' feelings, and feel compelled to fix or soothe those around them. Over time, this energy expenditure, particularly with narcissistic individuals, leads to depletion. When a fed-up empath reaches the untouchable stage, they no longer allow their energy to be siphoned. They conserve it, redirect it toward growth and self-care, and recognize that protecting their emotional reserves is not selfish, but necessary. The narcissist, once accustomed to drawing freely from this well, is left empty-handed. They have no leverage because the empath's energy is no longer accessible, and their influence over the empath evaporates completely. One of the most remarkable aspects of this transformation is its subtlety. Unlike a vengeful reaction which is visible and temporary, untouchability is consistent, calm, and almost invisible to the outside observer. The empath does not announce their detachment or seek to prove a point. They simply live in a state where their emotional availability is no longer negotiable. This quiet approach makes it devastatingly effective. The narcissist may attempt to provoke a response, escalate conflict, or employ charm tactics, but the empath's steady emotional state remains impervious. Silence, consistency, and emotional autonomy become the empath's most powerful tools, creating an aura of untouchability that cannot be penetrated. Another essential component is the empath's ability to let go of the need for external closure. Many empaths have historically sought understanding, apologies, or validation from those who caused them pain. While seeking closure can be a natural desire, relying on it from someone incapable of providing it keeps the empath tethered to dysfunction. At the untouchable stage, the empath understands that closure is internal. They no longer wait for recognition from the narcissist to validate their experiences or feelings. By taking full ownership of their emotional resolution, they break free from the last remaining chains of manipulation. This internalized closure reinforces their untouchable state because it means the narcissist's approval or remorse no longer holds any sway over their well-being. Being untouchable also involves a heightened sense of discernment. The empath can now quickly identify toxic behaviors and avoid being drawn into cycles of drama. They recognize manipulative language, subtle coercion, and emotional exploitation the moment it appears. Yet, they do not respond with aggression or confrontation. They respond with detachment. This skill is the product of experience, observation, and emotional maturity. The narcissist, who once relied on repeated patterns to maintain control, is unable to adapt to this new dynamic. The predictability they depended on is gone, leaving them powerless to regain influence. It is important to note that untouchability is not synonymous with isolation or emotional numbness. The empath still feels deeply, loves genuinely, and connects meaningfully with those who are trustworthy and reciprocal. The untouchable empath simply reserves these gifts for people and situations that honor them rather than exploit them. Emotional energy becomes a currency used wisely, not spent indiscriminately on those who will take it for granted. This discernment reinforces boundaries, strengthens detachment, and further solidifies the empath's untouchable state. For the narcissist, this shift is often incomprehensible. They have long relied on the empath's need for external validation as a source of control. Apologies, explanations, and admissions of wrongdoing were ways to manipulate the empath's emotional responses, whether through charm, guilt, or temporary reconciliation. When the empath stops seeking closure, the narcissist loses their most reliable lever. No matter how much they attempt to justify their behavior, deny responsibility, or recreate drama, the empath remains unmoved. Their emotional independence renders all tactics ineffective, and the narcissist is forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the empath's peace no longer depends on them. The process of internal closure also allows the empath to approach their own emotions with clarity and honesty. They examine their feelings, acknowledge the hurt, and validate their own experiences without needing permission from the person who caused the damage. This self-validation is crucial because it transforms lingering pain into lessons rather than anchors. Empaths understand that their emotional journey is theirs alone and that no external acknowledgement is required to process, heal, or grow. They recognize the difference between understanding and approval, between compassion and enabling, and between acknowledgement and absolution. What is particularly powerful about this shift is that it eliminates the emotional leverage the narcissist once held. Where once the narcissist could provoke guilt, frustration, or longing by withholding closure or offering half-hearted apologies, those tactics now fail entirely. The empath's detachment from the need for external resolution makes them untouchable in ways that are quiet but devastating. The narcissist may attempt to re-engage, offer explanations, or manipulate perceptions, but the empath meets all attempts with neutral awareness. There is no reaction to provoke, no vulnerability to exploit, and no narrative to control. The closure, being internal, cannot be revoked or withheld. This transformation also marks a shift in the empath's priorities. Energy once spent seeking external validation is redirected towards self-care, personal growth, and meaningful connections. They invest time and emotional resources into relationships and environments that nurture rather than deplete them. They learn to recognize signs of toxicity early, avoid repeating patterns that once trapped them, and trust their intuition without second-guessing. In this way, internal closure is not just a protective mechanism, it is a catalyst for long-term empowerment and resilience. Importantly, the empath's choice to no longer seek closure does not stem from bitterness or a desire for revenge. It stems from wisdom and self-respect. They understand that waiting for recognition from someone incapable of genuine accountability is futile. Instead, they focus on creating peace within themselves, which cannot be taken away. They release expectations and embrace the understanding that the past is immutable, but their response to it is entirely within their control. This internalized closure allows them to move forward with grace, confidence, and emotional freedom, unburdened by the manipulations and unresolved issues that once held them captive. Love bombing, perhaps one of the most insidious forms of manipulation, also fails to have any hold over a fed-up empath. Narcissists often deploy excessive charm, flattery, and attention to regain control after periods of conflict or detachment. They attempt to pull the empath back into the emotional orbit with seemingly irresistible affection, gifts, or declarations of care. But once the empath has disengaged, love bombing feels hollow and predictable. They no longer confuse attention with genuine emotional investment. The empath can see the intent behind excessive gestures. It is not love, it is a tactic to reclaim control. The recognition of this difference ensures that their emotional boundaries remain intact. The charm and manipulation no longer provoke longing, confusion, or lowered defenses. What makes this transformation remarkable is that it is rooted in self-respect, not retaliation. The empath does not need to attack, expose, or punish the narcissist to protect themselves. Simply seeing through manipulation and refusing to engage is enough. The empath's clarity transforms their silence into power. They no longer react impulsively, over-explain, or argue, all of which would once have played into the narcissist's hands. The lack of reaction is not weakness, it is mastery over the dynamic. Each manipulative tactic that used to provoke chaos now finds no response, and the narcissist's sense of control erodes quietly, relentlessly. This heightened perception also affects the empath's internal emotional state. Without manipulation causing confusion or guilt, their nervous system begins to calm. Stress and anxiety that once accompanied interactions with the narcissist diminish. Emotional energy is no longer wasted on deciphering hidden motives or trying to repair the irreparable. Instead, the empath can redirect focus to self-preservation, growth, and clarity. This internal shift is as much a part of the empowerment as the external boundaries they enforce. Additionally, seeing through manipulation instantly allows the empath to enforce boundaries with unwavering consistency. They can disengage emotionally without hesitation because they recognize precisely when a tactic is being employed. There is no overthinking, no second-guessing, and no self-blame. Boundaries are no longer negotiable. They are a natural and inevitable response to repeated patterns of manipulation. The empath's behavior communicates more than words ever could. Silence, calm detachment, and steady presence all signal that manipulation no longer works. For the narcissist, this shift is profoundly disorienting. They are accustomed to control through emotional leverage. When that leverage is removed, they become frustrated, confused, or desperate. Attempts to provoke, charm, or gaslight are met with neutral awareness, which makes the narcissist feel unseen, ineffective, and powerless. In many cases, this is when a narcissist escalates their tactics, trying harder to regain influence. But the empath, having seen it all before, remains unaffected. Their emotional clarity cannot be provoked because it is grounded in experience, observation, and self-respect. Ultimately, a fed-up empath no longer participates in the cycle of manipulation. They understand the motives, see the patterns, and refuse to engage, transforming their emotional intelligence into a quiet but unstoppable force. The narcissist loses not because the empath attacks, but because the empath no longer plays the game at all. The empath's awareness acts as both shield and boundary, rendering gaslighting, guilt-tripping, and love-bombing powerless. In this state, the empath becomes untouchable, not through aggression, but through clarity, detachment, and the unshakable knowledge that their emotional energy is theirs alone. The result is a dynamic that has been entirely rewritten. The narcissist, once confident in their ability to manipulate, suddenly finds all their strategies ineffective. The empath, however, is free. Free from confusion, free from guilt, free from emotional drain. This freedom is the ultimate testament to the empath's strength, not in loud confrontation, but in the quiet mastery of perception. And in this quiet mastery, the empath wields a power the narcissist never even imagined, the power of seeing clearly, detaching fully, and never being manipulated again. When an empath rewrites the power dynamic, it doesn't happen through confrontation or dominance. It happens the moment they stop seeking approval and stop hoping for fairness from someone who never intended to give it. For a long time, the empath may have believed that if they explained themselves clearly enough, stayed kind enough, or remained patient enough, the truth would eventually matter. They trusted that honesty would be met with accountability and that emotional effort would be reciprocated. But once the empath sees the pattern clearly, that belief dissolves. They realize the dynamic was never about understanding or balance. It was about control. The moment the empath stops asking to be understood, the entire structure collapses. They no longer defend themselves against false accusations or try to correct distorted versions of events. They no longer argue to prove their intentions or chase validation to feel secure. This is a quiet but radical shift because the narcissist's power depended on the empath's need for fairness. As long as the empath cared about being seen as good, reasonable, or right, the narcissist could manipulate the story. But when that need disappears, the narrative loses its grip. For the narcissist, this is disorienting. They're used to shaping perceptions, positioning themselves as the victim or authority, and controlling how the story is told. Suddenly, the empath isn't reacting. They aren't defending themselves publicly or privately. They aren't trying to win sympathy or clear their name. This absence of response feels like a loss of control, because it is. Without engagement, the narcissist cannot adjust the narrative or pull the empath back into the familiar roles. The story no longer has two active characters. It has only one voice echoing without resistance. What truly shifts the balance is that the empath no longer measures outcomes by fairness. They understand that fairness was never the goal of the dynamic, and waiting for it only prolonged the cycle. Instead, they choose self-respect and emotional stability. They accept that being misunderstood by someone committed to misunderstanding them is not a failure. This acceptance frees them from the emotional negotiations that once kept them trapped. The narcissist may continue telling their version of events, but the empath no longer feels compelled to respond or correct it. This is how the power dynamic is rewritten. Control moves away from who speaks the loudest or manipulates the story best, and toward who no longer needs to participate at all. The empath's silence is not surrender, it is independence. They are no longer playing the same game, under the same rules, or for the same rewards. The narcissist senses this shift intuitively and often reacts with frustration or confusion because their influence has vanished. When an empath reaches the point of being truly fed up, their emotional intelligence doesn't disappear, it sharpens. Empaths have always understood patterns, motives, and emotional undercurrents. They notice shifts in tone, inconsistencies in stories, and the unspoken needs behind manipulative behavior. For a long time, they use this awareness to empathize, to excuse, to repair, and to hold space for others, even at their own expense. But once clarity replaces hope, that same emotional intelligence takes on a different role. It no longer exists to save the connection, it exists to protect the self. The empath sees exactly what is happening, understands why it is happening, and recognizes how easily they could respond in ways that would expose vulnerabilities or regain control. And that is precisely why they don't. This is where emotional intelligence becomes quietly powerful. The empath knows which words would provoke insecurity, which silences would create unease, and which truths would dismantle the false image being maintained. They understand the narcissist's emotional triggers better than most because they once studied them in order to survive the dynamic. But instead of exploiting that knowledge, the empath chooses disengagement. They recognize that using insight to wound would still keep them emotionally tied to the same cycle. So they step back, not because they lack power, but because they finally understand where real power lies. To a narcissist, this restraint is deeply unsettling. They expect emotional intelligence to be used as leverage, manipulation, or retaliation. When it isn't, they are left without an opponent. The empath's calm presence or complete absence sends a clear message without saying a word. I see you clearly, and I no longer need to respond. This refusal to engage is not ignorance, it is discernment. The empath understands that reacting would only validate the narcissist's sense of importance. Silence, on the other hand, removes the stage entirely. What makes this moment so impactful is that the empath is no longer emotionally curious about the narcissist's behavior. They don't analyze motives to fix things anymore. They don't question whether they were misunderstood. Emotional intelligence stops being outward-facing and becomes inward-directed. The empath uses their awareness to maintain boundaries, regulate their own emotions, and avoid being pulled back into familiar patterns. They no longer confuse understanding someone with tolerating them. This shift often feels ruthless to the narcissist because it removes the emotional chessboard altogether. There is no back and forth, no emotional sparring, no opportunity to regain dominance. The empath's insight has not turned into cruelty, it has turned into clarity. They understand that the most effective response is no response at all. By refusing to exploit vulnerabilities, the empath breaks the unspoken contract of the dynamic, the expectation that emotions will always be accessible and negotiable. In the end, emotional intelligence becomes a weapon not through attack, but through restraint. The empath chooses dignity over dominance, peace over proving a point. They walk away knowing exactly what they are leaving behind, and that awareness gives their silence weight. The narcissist may never understand why the connection ended so cleanly, but the empath does, and that understanding is what finally sets them free. When an empath begins to grow quietly, the change is subtle but permanent. There is no dramatic exit, no public declaration of healing, and no attempt to prove how far they've come. Growth happens privately, away from the noise of the old dynamic. The empath stops explaining their choices, stops justifying their distance, and stops seeking permission to move forward. What replaces all of that is a steady inner shift, a sense of clarity that no longer needs validation. The silence is not emptiness, it is transformation happening out of sight. While this is happening, the narcissist often remains trapped in familiar cycles. The same patterns repeat: control, blame, manipulation, and the need for constant emotional stimulation. Without self-reflection, there is no real growth, only repetition. The narcissist may change tactics, but the underlying behavior stays the same. In contrast, the empath doesn't change strategies, they change direction. They step out of the loop entirely. This is why the growth feels so final. The empath is no longer orbiting the same emotional center. What makes this evolution powerful is its lack of performance. There are no announcements to signal distance, no explanations offered to ease discomfort, and no updates shared to provoke reaction. The empath understands that growth doesn't need an audience. They allow absence to speak for itself. Over time, the lack of access becomes the message. The narcissist may search for signs, explanations, or emotional openings, but there are none. The empath is simply no longer present in the way they once were. This quiet growth often unsettles the narcissist because it removes comparison. They can no longer measure themselves against the empath's reactions or influence the empath's emotional state. The empath's silence creates a vacuum where control once existed. Without feedback, the narcissist is left circling the same patterns, while the empath continues forward, emotionally untethered from the past. The permanence of this shift comes from internal change, not external behavior. The empath doesn't need to prove they've moved on because they genuinely have. Their priorities change, their nervous system calms, their sense of self becomes stronger and more grounded. They invest energy into healthier relationships, personal goals, and inner stability. The old dynamic loses relevance, not through conflict, but through disuse. In the end, the empath's absence becomes the clearest signal of growth, not because they vanished to make a point, but because they no longer belonged in the old pattern. While the narcissist stays busy repeating cycles, the empath evolves in silence. No explanations are given because none are needed. The connection doesn't end with a bang, it ends with quiet, and that quiet is permanent.